Well, I finally got some parts in. We got our gear and we have our shear pins as well. And then we got two types of grease here. Now normally you want to run 00 grease. It's a special grease. We got that from Stens. So what we also have is some Albania EP grease. There's your part number if you want to get it. Now some people might say, well, you know, what's the difference of using grease? Any kind of grease should be good, right? You could just pack it in there and you're good to go. Now the problem with that is a snowblower auger gear is in snow and it's always subjected to negative freezing temperatures. And you want a grease that's viscous enough, which means it flows enough to lubricate, but you don't want it to be like an oil. So I don't recommend putting oil in these things. I don't recommend putting any type of gear oil unless it's specifically designed for a snowblower gearbox. That Albania EP stuff, it's good for negative 40 degrees Celsius and it's viscous enough to the point where it'll lubricate, but it's thick enough to the point where it'll stay inside of the gearbox. So I'm going to be taking a look at both of these and then I'll probably pick which one I like better just by the way it flows. So the Albania should be good to run in snowblower auger, and if we look at it, we can see the viscosity. So it's pretty thick, but it's still a little runny, which is good because you don't want something really thick. Whereas this 00 grease, you guys can see it's a little thicker and you kind of got to work it into positions. But once I figure out which one I like better, I'll recommend it for you guys. As for our gearbox housing here, we're going to have to clean this all out. So you guys can see there's all types of brass bits in there. So I'm going to completely clear that out. And then we're going to take the old gear and we're going to slide it off the shaft. These little collars here, you can leave one, just take one off and then slide your gear off. Put your new gear on. So we'll have a look at that. Okay, so trying to get these little collars off, I'm running into an issue because right on there where the shear pins go through, there's a little burr. I don't know if you guys will be able to see it or not, but there's a little burr. So what I'm going to do is just clean up the ends of these holes on our shaft here, and then I should be able to, maybe I can take the wire wheel to all this rust as well. And to clean that up, I'm just going to be using a flap disc. So again, wire wheel on a drill. Hopefully that solves our issue. Let's see. There we go. So that's off. Now these gears do have a key and a keyway holding them in place. So if we look at our new gear here, we can see there's a keyway right there. So again, these can seize to the shaft, and that's what's happened with this one. So I'm probably going to clean up this end, move this collar out of the way as well, so that I can take maybe a closed end wrench over top and just smack it down so that I can break that corrosion that's in there, because that thing's on pretty tight and I can't move it. Okay, so we're finally getting the gear moving. You guys can see we're going to the right. Here's the keyway. We got our key out. You don't want to lose that. But because this shaft has so much corrosion, even though I've taken the wire wheel to it, it's still pretty tricky to get the gear off of the shaft. We've got it past the hole now where the shear pin goes, so I'm going to just keep, well, I've been hitting it with a small, tiny little hammer because realistically this thing's already broken and it doesn't really matter if we damage it anymore. But I don't want to have to do that to the new one when we go to put that one on. So what I'm going to do is probably take my flap disc on my grinder there once I get this off and just go lightly over the whole shaft, and then hopefully that should solve the issue. Okay, so flap disc to the length of the shaft there worked good because now I should be able to slide that right off. There we go. Perfect. Oh, and by the way, you do have washers on either side of the gear, and then you have your bushings. And there's your difference in gears. So obviously this side just completely worn down. There's our new gear. Okay, so now that we've made a big mess, basically before you put your gear onto the shaft, you want to make sure you have your collar, and then you want to make sure you have a washer here. And then we'll go ahead and put our key into our keyway, and then we'll go ahead and grease the inside of our gear, and then we'll slide that onto the shaft to make sure it's positioned, and then we'll go ahead and take our washer and our other bushing and slide that on, and then that part will be done. And once again, I'm running into an issue where the gear doesn't want to go into the center with the key in, even with the key out, because there's a couple tiny little burrs where the keyway is. So again, I'm just going to take the flap disc to that lightly. You could file it if you don't have a grinder and a flap disc. That'll just take a little bit longer. You just want to make sure that your keyway is clear so that the key doesn't sit up higher, because you know, if you have debris inside of that keyway, then your key won't sit inside of there nicely. It'll be up a little higher, which will put added pressure on your gear, which you don't want. But again, right now I just got to get rid of these burrs so that I can center this thing up. And then once I know that it'll go into the center position, then I can put my key in and fit the gear on. Okay, so you can see that cleaning this up with the flap disc made all the difference. We still have a little bit of ways to go because we want to center this gear up where that keyway is. So what I'm doing is using a soft blow hammer, and what I'm doing is I'm just tapping it all the way around. If you had like a piece of PVC pipe or something, you could do that, you know, use a piece of long PVC and tap it at the end, and it would put a nice even distribution of force. But for right now, this should be fine. And you guys want to try to get this gear as close as possible to dead center. So kind of gauge how much depth you have before you see your key on the left side, and then same thing on the right. And you guys can see we're pretty close. So this should be good. So now what I'll do is go ahead and get the washer on and then the collar on, and then fit those up to where they were before. So now I'm going to move on to clearing out the gearbox, and you guys want to make sure that you're cleaning it out good. So don't leave any bits behind, because again, if you leave little tiny bits, you can see there, soft metal. And again, same thing with the glob over here. You want to get all those metallic bits out of there. So I'm going to completely wipe this all down. Okay, so once you get your housings wiped out and you're confident that there's no little bits of metal laying around, this is a good time to talk about our next little tip. So right here, you guys can see there's a little flat edge on the tops of this, because again, your worm gear goes at the top and then your gear goes at the bottom from this shaft here. So basically this little flat spot here correlates to a flat spot on this little collar on your shaft here. So you're going to have two flat spots, one right there, and then there's going to be one on this side as well. You can see it right there. So you guys are going to want to line those up to the tops of that when we put it in. So what I'm going to do now is pack these full of 00 grease, all in here just like it was before, all the way around here. And then what we'll do is slide our shaft in, line up one of those little collars there, make sure it's fitted in snug, and then we'll line up our worm gear on our shaft there, and then we'll take this side packed full of grease, same thing with our gasket. And then once we have this gear and that into one side, then we can go ahead and close the other side on top of it. Okay, so what I've done is taken our Sten's 00 grease and put it in. It has a nice little applicator cap that you just got to cut off, and we're just putting it in, laying it in nice and thick. So what I've done is I've used the right side housing, because on the left side housing we have our little grease access port here. So what I figured was if I pack the 00 grease in on this side, and then we put our shaft in, line up everything, and then we lay in our worm gear and make sure everything's good, then we can go ahead and put our gasket on, and then we can pack this side full of grease, flip it over, and then basically once this is all put together and we have all the bolts in and everything's tight, then I'm going to leave it kind of sideways so that when I take this off, gravity will help feed any oil to areas that it's not in, right? So I figured that if I did it on this side and there was a bunch of grease packed in real tight on this side, and it was in front of that little access port there, then it might not go in as well. So I'm just going to do it this way and see how it works out. So it should look a little something like this. The gear doesn't go all the way down to the bottom, right? Because it's going to be half and half. And I made sure that that little flat spot was lined up to the little groove. So now I'm going to set this up probably on my other table so that I can work on it just like this. So I just set up my little workbench here, and it's got a bunch of holes in it, and sure enough it was the same size, well, a little bit bigger than the shaft itself. So now I can kind of set it up like this. So basically it sits nice and flush. I can make sure that the gear sits nice and flush. I can come in over here and extend this and line up our other worm gear and our second stage, and then I can go ahead and fit everything together like this, and it's a little bit easier than doing it horizontal, I guess. Okay, and before I go ahead and pack grease into this side, I want to show you guys that the top of this has a little flat spot on it right there, and that correlates to the flat spot on the top of this collar. So when we go to lay this in, we're going to lay it with the flat side facing up. And I could show you guys just how it looks when the collar is lined up. So you could go ahead and fit this right into there, and once you get it lined up to the proper spot, it should drop in, and then when you look at it from this angle, it should be flush or close to flush. So you just want to make sure that that's down as far as you can get it to go. Okay, so after moving some things around, basically I got it set up a little something like this. And when your second stage spins that way, because you guys have to remember that this here is the bottom and this is the top, your drive shaft here will spin this way. So this side will be going that way. That's what the inside of a auger gear looks like. Pretty interesting. So now what I'm going to do is, now that it's in this position, and again our flat on our front collar there is lined up to the flat on our little auger housing, I'm going to go ahead and pump some more 00 grease in here. It's not as thick as I thought, so I'll probably end up using it. It seems pretty good. So again, I'll go get some more into all the little crevices that I've missed, and then we'll go ahead, put the gasket on, lay the top cover on, packed full of grease as well, so we'll have to pack that one full of grease as well, and then we should be ready to start bolting this thing together. And you guys want to lay it in nice and thick. Nice and thick. And like I said, you want to try and get all the little spots that might not be packed full of grease. If a little bit gets on your aluminum housing where your gasket goes, that's okay. We can always wipe that down before we put the gasket on. But like I said, I'm just trying to pack this in here nice and thick so that I don't have to worry. Get it all over the gear on the inside here. That should be good. So now this side looks a little something like that. I put a little extra in between where the worm gear goes to the ring gear there, and then again laid it in nice and thick around that edge. And then on this side, same thing, laid it in nice and thick. So we got a good packing of grease in there. Now when you go to fit this left side onto your other side of the gearbox, if it doesn't set all the way down and becomes flush with this once the gasket is on there, it means that your collar here, and specifically the flat spot on that collar, isn't lined up to the flat spot onto the aluminum gearbox housing. So again, you just want to make sure that this is in the correct position, and then you should be able to just drop that straight down. So it should look a little something like that. Get it lined up, and then now I should be able to drop this right on top of there, line everything up perfectly, and then bolt everything together. You want to line up your gasket too, make sure you don't pinch that, because a gasket was like 24 bucks for this thing. And this one's still good, so I didn't want to have to replace it. I can feel we're still lined up, so now I should be able to drop this straight down. And we shouldn't have any issues. Okay, and after giving it a couple taps at the back there with a soft blow hammer, everything's lined up now, so I should be ready to put my bolts in. So what I did was I just came back here, gave it a little tap right on the back there, and now it makes a nice seal and got everything lined up with that back little seal there. I think that's what we were getting hung up on. Okay, now go ahead and start tightening up your bolts. We're just going to get everything snug. Now this hole at the back, the nut doesn't want to go on because the nut they're like washer nuts, so they have like a really big head on them, and it just doesn't want to go in there, so I'm just going to grind a little bit off of the nut, and now's a good time. Wipe off any excess grease that comes out of there. So you guys can see I kind of just ground off just a little bit of it, just enough to the point where now I can line it up a little bit easier. And once you get everything tightened up, go ahead and give your second stage a spin back here, and make sure your shaft spins nicely. So when we spin this here, we can see our shaft is spinning nicely and there's no binding. I could feel it. So we're good. So I'm going to get this workbench out of here. I'm going to set everything back up, and we're going to go ahead and get that auger back inside of the auger housing. Okay, and I'd just like to add that I have everything tight now, and the design of this gearbox here is pretty decent. You guys can see they got, I think, 7 bolts going around the entire machine, more so at the bottom than at the top. I would have liked to have seen another bolt right here, but there wasn't one. So because of that, your gasket right here doesn't seal as nice as I would have liked it to. Even if you had a new one, it probably would have been the same because there's no contact points to close this area, right? It's a gap between here and there, whereas on the bottom side, you guys can see there's tons, right? You got contact points here and here, you got contact points there and there, so you got them all over the place. So what I did was I took a little bit of Permatex gasket maker and I just laid it on there, and I'm gonna let that dry. So basically that'll make a nice weatherproof seal, and I shouldn't have to worry about any water getting in there. And like I had mentioned before, I got the access port here off of the side, and what I'm gonna do now is just take my grease and pack it in there best I can until the point where it starts coming out, just like that. And then I'm going to rotate this, try to work it around. And as you rotate it around, you should see your worm gear moving inside of there. And I'm just going to try to keep working it maybe backwards. So I'm going to rotate it in the reverse way that it would normally go, so that that worm gear kind of spirals backwards. And I'll keep pumping some grease in there while I'm rotating this the opposite direction, so that it keeps trying to pull that grease towards the back, and it'll fill any sections that may not have grease into it. And I think that's it. I think we're filled. We could see some grease coming out of there now. So I'm just going to wipe that off. Get our bolt back in here, tighten that back up, and then this is ready to go back onto the machine. Okay, before we put this auger back into the housing, obviously we're going to have to put our impellers back on, and once we do that, we're going to have to put our shear pins in. But the thing is, the old shear pins here, they were the wrong ones, and obviously you can see it's damaged and bent, and it didn't shear. And this was the reason right here, guys, why that gear ended up getting worn out like that. So we have ordered the correct shear pins. We ordered 4. This one takes 2, one right there and one right there once our impellers go on, and then we're going to have an extra 2 that we can give to our customer, and he can hang on to them. Basically, if he ever shears them, then he'll have them on hand, and he won't have to go and call us or order them himself. And before we do any of that, I'm going to be using some nickel anti-seize on our drive shaft up at the front and also at the back, because you have to remember that's going into the bearing. And if you ever have to take the bearing off, I don't want the bearing to seize to the shaft. So again, we're going to be putting it on the back of that shaft as well. So once you got your impellers on, before you put your shear pins in, you want to make sure that both your impellers have the fins going towards the inside. This machine, it doesn't matter. You can flip this one inside or out. You can put this side on that side. It doesn't matter. They're all the same. But some designs, depending on if you have one of those 3-stage snowblowers, I'm not too sure if anything's different. So again, it's just a good time to check that everything lines up and that everything's in the proper position. And once you have all that done, now's a good time to take some grease, put it inside of these little end keepers here, and we'll pop them onto either side of our auger here, and then we'll go ahead, slide it into the machine. Make sure you don't damage the bearing when you put it in, go in nicely, and then we'll go ahead and bolt this up. Okay, the auger's in now, and we can see that our shaft is all the way back. And before we put our bolts in, I've gone ahead and taken some nickel anti-seize to these, just to make sure that if anybody ever has to get them out, they'll come out nice and easily. Now we can go ahead and take our little spacer here, put that onto the shaft, go ahead and get our key lined up in our keyway. Make sure that your key is seated all the way flush in your keyway. You don't want to shear it, so you just want to make sure there's no debris in there. Then we could go ahead and take our flywheel, put that down flush, and then we'll go ahead and get our lock bolts in there. Now these are called set screws or lock bolts, whatever you want to call them, but these had, you could see a little bit of blue thread locker left on them. So what I'm going to do is just clean these off on the wire wheel and then use some blue Permatex thread locker and put them back in. And now we're ready to take the front half of the machine and pair it to the back half. Before we do that, we're going to have to get the belt on. Now, the belt over here, it has a little keeper right there. So that post coming out of the idler arm, that's basically a keeper. So that arm keeps this belt onto this pulley. So when this up here is out, this goes in and kind of keeps the belt on. And then obviously when it's engaged, it's tight and you don't need a keeper because the belt has tension on it. So what I'm going to do is wrap this belt around the pulley on the auger, and then we could go ahead and fit it onto our bolts at the bottom, slide it in again at a 45-degree angle. Now this part might be tricky doing it by yourself. I got kind of like a chair back there set up so it's holding it, but it's a lot easier when you have a second person holding the back half, and then you can go ahead and get the front half in. Okay, so I had the old man come out just to hold the back because the chair wasn't working. Once you get the bottom in, go ahead and tighten both of them up just a bit so they're snug. And then what you can do is come up to here. You're going to push that in, and you'll see that our little stud here will come away from your pulley. You'll be able to then rotate your auger up, get a bolt in here, and then you can go ahead and just wrap your belt around and fit it through our idler there. So what I'm probably going to do is loosen that off and then just tighten it up a little bit because that is quite a bit of space there. So I'll probably loosen that off and rotate it that way down more so that it comes a little closer to this pulley here. I also hooked our chute control back up and put a new cotter pin in there now. So the main repair on this machine is done. The auger works now. Everything's good. I'll take it outside after and fire it up. But one of the things that I have to do, I'm going to have to flip it up because the access panel at the bottom is coming loose on that side. He wanted an oil change anyway, so I'm probably going to take it outside, run it, make sure everything works. It should. And then I'll drain the oil and just tighten up that access panel. I think maybe he lost a bolt. And then I'll be able to flip it back down, put some fresh oil in it. He also said there was an issue of the machine pulling to one side or the other. I'm not too sure which side, but he said it would pull to one side when he would use it. And if I come over here, this machine, the way it's designed, shouldn't move left or right, but you can see we can rotate both ways. The reason is because somebody took a pin and they put it on the outside of this tire. So you guys can see here, this pin isn't holding anything on. This pin here is supposed to go through that hole, and then that basically holds the tire onto the shaft. So what was happening was anytime you put it into drive, it was only driving the right wheel, so I'm guessing it would push towards the left. But that's not a big issue. I just pull that out, rotate the wheel until I find the correct position, and pop it back in. So now you can see with the pin in the proper location, the tire is attached to the axle now. So I'm going to take this thing outside, fire it up, throw some snow real quick, just make sure everything's working, just get that oil circulating and warmed up too. So let's see how she runs. Runs good. The only thing is it doesn't go into reverse. But the friction wheel is good because when I put it into drive, it goes and it actually pulls on you. So if you pull back on the handle, it wants to try to walk away from you, which means the friction wheel is engaging good. And that's also because I tightened up his drive cable just slightly. I didn't have to do that for the auger side because we did end up putting the proper tension on the belt. So everything's good now. The only thing is that reverse issue, but I don't think he is too concerned about that. A machine this light, you can just pull it backwards. Yeah, so once this machine warmed up, it runs really well, and it was throwing the snow like it should. So the issue is solved. So like I said, I'm going to drain the oil now, and then we also got him some skid plates. I'm not going to include them in his build just now because we welded that one and kind of bent it around a little bit. But if he wants them at a later time, we have brand new ones. So we ordered a bunch of them from Stens, and there's your part number there. They're just your average Murray OEM skid plates. But yeah, so if he ever wants them, we ordered some for him and a couple extras as well. So the auger gear's been replaced. The auger housing's been painted. The auger belt has the proper tension on it now. We cleaned and gapped the spark plug, and we also changed the oil, put some synthetic premium 5W30 oil in there, and this thing is done. And just a little pro tip, you're going to want to remember that the whole reason we had to replace this ring gear here was because the wrong shear pin was installed. So because this pin didn't shear, it bent like it did, You can tell it transferred that power in towards the Auger gearbox, and the weakest link, which was the soft metal of this ring gear here, it just completely got torn apart by the harder material on the worm gear. And you have to remember that none of this would have happened if you would have had the proper shear bolts in it, because the bolts would have broke, and they cost, I think, $1.75 each. So again, over $200 in repairs compared to $1.75. That's a pretty substantial difference. Well, that's it for part 2. If you enjoyed the video, think about leaving me a thumbs up. You know, it really helps me out. The snowblower works great, and my buddy was real happy to get his machine back. You can click here to subscribe, and you can click over here to watch one of my previous videos. I upload every single week, so be sure to come on back next week. Check the channel out for new and exciting content every single week. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.